So I just completed Life is Strange Before the Storm again. I lost track of how many times it's been, but going by my playtime, I must have played this game from start to finish over 10 times already, and I don't see it ending there. And I'll be honest, that's not because of the enticing action-packed gameplay, since this game doesn't have that. Like all the entries in the Life is Strange series, Before the Storm focuses almost exclusively on interactive storytelling. Across 3 acts that together take around 8 hours to complete, you play as Chloe Price, a troubled high school girl who forms a tumultuous friendship with the enigmatic Rachel Amber. Together, they uncover the hidden truths of their hometown while also plotting to escape to greener pastures together. Before the Storm is a prequel to the original Life is Strange, and as in that game, the appeal of Before the Storm comes from unraveling the mysteries of its setting, the fictional Oregon town of Arcadia Bay. Even though the player may still question some of the more intentionally ambiguous parts of the story, the secrets that this game has to offer will, for the most part, have been revealed by the time you reach the end. So why on earth would I replay a game like that? Sure, you can make different choices as a player, and some of those choices will lead to different outcomes, but the sequence of events remains more or less the same. This is not like a choose-your-own-adventure book where you skip 15 pages if you turn left instead of right. In this sense, the game ceases to surprise you. But it's in Before the Storm that I experienced something new. Whenever I replayed the game, I noticed new things. Aspects of the story that suddenly stood out to me, characters that seemed much more nuanced than I'd given them credit for, or scenes that I now viewed from a radically different perspective. As I gained more life experience, I was able to relate to different parts of the narrative. The story seemed more profound the more I returned to it over the years. Now, when I say that this was a novel experience to me, I mean in relation to video games. I was already well familiar with this phenomenon, but only through other media, such as books or cinema. If I'm honest, I've long had a bit of a love-hate relationship with stories in video games. Don't worry, I'm not gonna be snobbish about video game stories for not being good or enjoyable. Still, I do recognize that I need an amount of suspend disbelief in order to enjoy the narratives in most video games. In many a game, the story clearly exists in service to the gameplay. How many games have you sat through conversations that lasted just long enough to cover the time it took for the travel sequence to complete? Or your character walking into a very obvious ambush just so you get to fight your way out in a glorious action-packed gunfight. More than in other media, video game stories tend to have to deal with a lot of logistics in order to make set pieces happen and to make the game actually fun to play. And this is completely fine, by the way. For example, the Mass Effect trilogy does these things all the time, and it might be my favorite gaming experience of all time. It's just that more often than not, the story, even if it's a vital aspect of the overall experience, is itself not the point. Life is Strange Before the Storm is not completely clean of some of the gamey techniques I just described, but it's one of the very few video game stories where I felt that often the gameplay actually operated in service of the narrative and not the other way around. In doing this, the writers managed to create a story that benefits from the video game format, in one way transcending it and telling a story that's good in its own right, but in another also creating something that could not have worked as well had it been a novel or a TV show. It's because the creators of Before the Storm commanded these storytelling techniques so well that they were able to create a story that has nuance, symbolism, different layers, and a deep level of engagement with the players. In playing this game numerous times and relating it to the life experience I was accruing in the meanwhile, I saw more and more clearly the psychological underpinnings of the narrative. How many of the characters were driven by trauma and grief without being defined by those things, adding true complexity to their personalities and the often irrational ways in which they chose to act. While by itself, the presence of these themes will not be new to those who have experienced the game, they run deeper than some of you might think. So for this video, I'd like to take you on a journey to explore the themes of trauma, loss and grief in Before the Storm, and how their presence is made even more impactful by the game design. One goal I have with this video is to make it interesting to both fans of the series and those who've never even heard of it until now. For fans of the series, I've included chapters to help you navigate in case some of the information I'm relaying sounds a little too familiar. And for newcomers, I will start with an overview of the story of the original Life is Strange before we delve into the closer reading of the events of Before the Storm, which should make this video easy to understand without needing any prior knowledge of the series. As such, this is your first and only major spoiler warning for both of these games. If you choose to keep watching, this choice will have consequences. Life is Strange Before the Storm was released episodically throughout the second half of 2017. It is a prequel to the original game, simply titled Life is Strange, whose 5 episodes had been released 2 years prior. So in order to even understand the premise of Before the Storm, we must first turn our eyes to the original game, which I'll mostly refer to as Life is Strange 1 from here on. Life is Strange 1 is a narrative-driven adventure game. In it, you play as Max Caulfield, a young photographer who returns to her hometown of Arcadia Bay, Oregon, to attend the prestigious Blackwell Academy. The story starts as a high school drama of sorts, where the introverted Max must navigate a campus full of the archetypes you'd expect there, such as jocks, nerds, and mean girls. Most of the gameplay consists of interactive storytelling, meaning that you'll explore each area, talk to the people through dialogue trees, and make certain choices which can have a strong impact on the events of the game. You can also interact with a ton of objects to hear Max's inner monologue comment on whatever she's looking at, allowing you to really enter her headspace.
No, officer, I'm not snooping. Just admiring Victoria's cutting-edge tech.
Beyond this basic setup, the game also has a strong supernatural component to it from the start. While in class, Max discovers that she is able to rewind time, allowing her to engage with the events around her with prior knowledge. This power forms another core gameplay mechanic of the game, as many scenarios will allow or even require you to go back in time and alter your choices. And naturally, it plays a key role in the story as well. Right before Max figures out she has a superpower, she goes to freshen up in the school bathroom. While in there, she sees her old childhood friend Chloe and promptly witnesses her being fatally shot by fellow student Nathan Prescott. Max reacts in horror and unleashes some sort of force, after which she finds herself back in class, where she'd just been. Knowing what's about to happen in a bathroom, she runs there after class and pulls the fire alarm, preventing Chloe from getting shot by Nathan, kicking off the events of Life is Strange. If that sounds like a lot, it's because it is. Life is Strange deals with a myriad of topics, and high-stakes incidents, such as the one I've just described, follow each other in rapid succession. I sometimes even refer to it as a trauma simulator. At its core though, Life is Strange is not about such incidents, but about the relationship between Max and Chloe. The two had been best friends throughout most of their childhood, but one fateful day, Chloe's father William died in a car accident. To add to her sorrow, around the same time, her best friend Max moved away with her family to Seattle, one state over. The contact between the two watered down, and by the time they meet in Life is Strange, the two hadn't spoken in years. The course of events has upset Chloe, as she feels like her friend abandoned her in her time of need. This causes tension between Chloe and Max, which is noticeable in the moments following their reunion, and you essentially spend most of the game helping them grow closer once again as they both enter adulthood. At its core, it is a coming-of-age story where most of the events serve to add more depth to the friendship between Chloe and Max. One major driving force behind this rekindling friendship is the character of Rachel Amber. I say character, but she's not a character that you can meet or interact with like any other character in the game. Rachel was Chloe's best friend during the time that Max was away, and it is strongly implied the two were also romantically involved to some degree. Rachel had, however, gone missing a few months before Max's return to Arcadia Bay. Chloe appears to be the only one still looking for her, and the search for Rachel is what drives most of the game's narrative. This culminates in Chloe and Max finding Rachel's body in a local junkyard. She'd been murdered by photography teacher Mark Jefferson and his associate Nathan Prescott. In one sense, Rachel does not actually appear in the game as much more than an old photo on a missing persons poster. But in another sense, Rachel is present everywhere in Arcadia Bay. From the moment you first set foot on the grounds of Blackwell Academy, you can ask just about anyone about Rachel Amber. Her name even appears multiple times in graffiti on school grounds. From all these interactions, you get the impression that Rachel was a different person to different people, a sort of social chameleon. Though whether loved or hated, Rachel still has a noticeable presence on campus in both word and image, and she is impossible to avoid in this way. even if, as it would later turn out, she was already long gone from this earth. During the climax of the game, a giant, all-consuming storm threatens to destroy all of Arcadia Bay. Chloe interprets this as Rachel's rage, her final revenge on the community that had failed her. Whether you subscribe to this theory or not, and whether you interpret this in a literal or a symbolic manner, it underlines the strong presence of Rachel in Arcadia Bay, even in death. With all of this being a supernatural murder mystery in an ethereal town in the Pacific Northwest, it won't come as a shock to many of you that this game has taken quite a lot of inspiration from the cult television show Twin Peaks, with Rachel Amber of course being analogous to Laura Palmer. In that show, Laura Palmer, in spite of her death, still commands a strong presence in town life, as does Rachel Amber in Life is Strange. The difference being that Laura Palmer's death is known to both the viewer and the characters from the get-go, whereas the murder of Rachel Amber is not revealed until late into the game. Despite this, Rachel's death was inevitable within the context of the story. The mystery surrounding her is what brings Chloe and Max together, and once their reunion is complete, Rachel's presence is no longer needed. In fact, had Rachel somehow survived and returned to Chloe, it would have made for a difficult situation, as Max essentially takes over, or even takes back, the role Rachel had in Chloe's life. The idea that Max is replacing Rachel is made clear in the game, as Max can wear Rachel's clothes, and in an arguably even less subtle move, Chloe can under one circumstance change the background of her phone, replacing the photo of her and Rachel with one of Max. Reintroducing Rachel would have complicated the storytelling, both because her role was already being filled by another character, and because the entire point of Rachel was that she was not really a character at all, but more of an enigmatic presence, a presence that could be wildly different to you depending on your perspective, and because of this made Rachel seem more like a local myth or legend rather than a person of flesh and blood. To have revealed her would have broken that magic. With that in mind, you can imagine that people were more than a bit skeptical when Before the Storm was announced. This story was to be a prequel to Life is Strange, delving into the relationship between Chloe and Rachel, how they met, how they grew closer as they entered a new phase of their lives, while trying to solve a mystery in the picturesque town of Arcadia. Wait, haven't we just been there? What's more, wasn't the whole point of Rachel that her presence was implied, larger than life, and so amazing that it cannot and probably should not be believed? Wouldn't a game that gives her a voice and more than a bit of screen time only damage that reputation? What made it even worse is that this wasn't even made by the same developer. You see, despite the game being set in the US and featuring many tropes we know from American media, Life is Strange was actually created by French developer Don't Nod. Yet, Before the Storm was to be developed by Deck 9, a small American studio whose biggest claim to fame up until that point had been developing snowboarding games and remastering a handful of Ratchet & Clank titles. Sure, Life is Strange had its issues. A lot of the dialogue could be corny, some characters never made it out of stereotype territory, the whole time-traveling thing didn't make a lot of sense the more you thought about it, and the game seemed to keep a checklist of covering so many taboo topics that going over all of them would probably get this video demonetized. But despite all of that, it had soul. The setting of Arcadia Bay was and is as magical as it is believable. The whole experience is drenched in nostalgia, featuring detailed, recognizable environments and a carefully curated soundtrack of indie folk and pop that has this immediately recognizable vibe that you just can't put your finger on. The whole thing felt like a dream. In other words, it was lightning in a bottle. So surely some no-name studio wasn't going to capture it for a second time. Seldom have we been so fortunate to be so wrong. Before the Storm turned out to be a success and was embraced by most fans and critics, with some even favoring the prequel over the original work. In order to make the game succeed, the writers at Deck 9 had to overcome quite some obstacles. By analyzing how they managed to do so, we can learn a lot about the quality of the writing and the extra dimensions added to some of the key characters. So, I'll give you an ample overview of the story of Before the Storm and the techniques that were used to alleviate concerns that players might have had, to then draw them into this brave new world. In order to do that, first we'll need to know what the biggest obstacles actually were. As we've already discussed, they first needed to make Rachel Amber live up to the almost mythical reputation she'd had in the first game, of having been a person with irresistible charm but also a complex personality that contrasted her image as the perfect student and friend. When you add color to a drawing and the colors you pick are too bright, too flat, or otherwise unfitting, you can end up ruining an otherwise beautiful drawing. What before seemed tasteful and soothing can be turned into something garish and horrid. So Deck 9 had to tread carefully here and pick the right colors. Another challenge, or rather limitation, that the developers had to contend with was the more general issue of Before the Storm being a prequel. With the first Life is Strange having been a game that prides itself in presenting the players with choices that truly mattered and even delved into wild subject matter such as chaos theory, alternate dimensions and time travel, the conclusion of this prequel, by definition, had to lead into a static, predetermined set of events. As a result, Deck 9 were much less free than the original developers, don't nod, in surprising the player. A third big issue was that there were those who didn't think Chloe, the deuteragonist of the first game, could carry a new entry as its main character. Being a rebellious teenager, Chloe could at times be more than a little obnoxious, and the way that she gave Max a hard time over moving away from Arcadia Bay all those years ago rubbed some fans the wrong way. So let's take a look at how Deck 9 were able to face these challenges and make this experience not just palatable, but an enrichment of the original story. Starting, of course, with the introduction of our protagonist, Chloe. Canonically, Before the Storm is set in 2010, roughly 3 years before the events of Life is Strange 1. As stated, you play as Chloe Price, who at this point in time is a 16-year-old girl that's struggling in life. Chloe is still in the middle of grieving for her father, William, who died 2 years earlier when a truck ran a red light and hit his car. Chloe's grief is further complicated by the absence of her best friend Max. As we'd seen in Life is Strange 1, Chloe was deeply affected by this absence, but because that game didn't add all of the context, there were voices who considered Chloe to be a bit petty or even whiny about the two of them losing contact. Everyone knows that childhood friends can kind of come and go. One day the parents of your best friend might move cross-country and there's little either of you can do about it. You may pledge to keep in touch, but you know how the saying goes, out of sight, out of mind. Things eventually water down, you make new friends, and you go on with your now separate lives. How many of us have known kids that we'd spent nearly every day of our lives with, sometimes for years on end, and now we haven't seen or heard from them in years? One thing Before the Storm manages to do from the get-go is make us understand just how much Max's departure has affected Chloe and how she still struggles with it after all this time. At any point in the game, you can access Chloe's text messages and her diary. Her diary is itself interesting as all of the entries are written in the form of unsent letters to Max. These entries lay bare the resentment Chloe still feels towards Max, and through the layer of typical teenage angst and sarcasm, you can also sense a deep sadness. Further context is available if you choose to dig into Chloe's text message history, where you can read how Chloe tries to keep the contact with Max alive, but Max is, shall we put it, not too diligent about responding. Until at one point she appears to have completely ghosted Chloe. This information casts a new light on Chloe's behavior in Life is Strange 1, as Chloe was in desperate need of a friend, and that friend had, in her eyes, failed her. I've even seen complaints by other players where they say the writers did too good of a job, inadvertently making them lose sympathy for Max, as she had so heartlessly abandoned her best friend. I do think personally that this is a little harsh, as Max is also just a teenage girl at this point, an introverted one who doesn't really know how to deal with the intense emotions felt by her more mature friend. I, myself, as someone who frequently fails to text back friends in real life, suspect it might be less about not caring and more about not knowing what to say, and getting a sort of mental blockade that just builds over time until the very thought of responding turns your stomach upside down. In any case, the more interesting takeaway from this optional exposition is that it shows that Chloe is going through a complex grief process. Grief can become complex due to the factors surrounding the death of a loved one. In the case of Chloe, her dad died suddenly and without warning when she was just 14 years old, which is of course a very young age to have to lose a parent. As an only child, the only person she was able to share her grief with was her mother. But grieving for a father has a very different dynamic to it than grieving for a husband. The perfect person to share her grief with was, in fact, Max, who'd spent a big part of her childhood in the Price household and effectively occupied the role of the sibling that Chloe never had. It was exactly that person that Chloe had lost all contact with not long after the accident. Chloe's solitary, prolonged grieving process is what therapists refer to as complicated grief, and there's even an official diagnosis that considers this a mental disorder, since it can severely impact the day-to-day functioning of the one suffering from it. What therapists also say is that one of the best ways to speed up or otherwise alleviate this process is to share the grief with others. And that's exactly what Chloe cannot seem to do. Her emotions have nowhere to go, and she is still confronted with the consequences of losing her dad every single day. As a result, Chloe is stuck, because the sadness she feels over having lost him can at times still feel as raw as the day that it happened. I've spoken a lot about the grieving process that Chloe is going through the moment you take control of her in the game, because it's this grief that informs so many of her behaviors and actions in the first act, and being aware of that is vital to understanding and appreciating the character. After a brief prologue sequence where Chloe talks her way into a DIY rock show, gets into a scrap with some local lowlives, and meets Rachel for the first time when she swoops in to save her, the first act truly gets started when Chloe wakes up the next day and has to get ready for school. Before she even gets out of bed, Chloe looks at an old photo of her dad, and Max, immediately confronting the player with the fact that, as said, Chloe's grieving process is still in full swing. That she still chooses to wake up with this image every day means that part of her hasn't accepted that either of them are gone. If there's a central theme to the scenes that follow, it is conflict. The first person Chloe runs into on her way to school is her mother, Joyce, and they argue. Though the player is able to direct whether the argument is resolved or escalated, it becomes clear in their argument that Joyce is on a very different trajectory from Chloe when it comes to processing and moving on from William's death. Chloe finds out that Joyce is planning to sell her old engagement ring, and that she's hidden or even discarded old photos of her and her late husband. Joyce also has a new boyfriend, David Madsen, whose personality couldn't be more different from William's. Where William was a loving, soft-spoken and understanding man who trusted Chloe with a big amount of freedom and agency, even as a child, David is at first presented as kind of a hard-ass. An unemployed war veteran who, at least at first, treats his would-be stepdaughter Chloe like a problem that needs to be solved, and thinks Joyce isn't being hard enough on her. It's therefore no surprise that David is a topic of contention when Chloe and Joyce argue, nor is it a shock that Chloe isn't too fond of the idea of David driving her to school that day. When Chloe and David interact soon thereafter, the atmosphere is predictably uncomfortable. David, in this moment, shows no particular appreciation for Chloe's situation, and Chloe in turn barely makes an effort to hide her disgust for just about every aspect of David's being, from his mustache to his muscle car. In the driveway, Chloe can once again choose to get into an argument with David, telling him to back off when David tries to explain her the errors of her ways in not too subtle a manner. Once at the school grounds, there are several interactions that are available, some of which are finally more positive, but once again, there are plenty of verbal scraps to be had. For one, Chloe gets into an argument with the principal of Blackwell Academy, Raymond Wells, who, among other things, accuses her of drug use. Chloe also has conversations with fellow students Victoria, Elliot, and Evan, which, while not so openly hostile, do indicate that she doesn't appear to be on the same wavelength as her peers, and cannot bring herself to care about the same things they do. Chloe then has to pick up a copy of Blade Runner from her friend Steph, and has the option to play a tabletop RPG with her and her friend Mikey North, who, in turn, is the younger brother of resident football jock Drew. Drew also happens to be Chloe's last hurdle before entering the school building. He can be seen bullying Nathan Prescott, and Chloe can choose to intervene on his behalf. This leads to an interesting meta moment, as the events of Life is Strange 1 showed that Nathan would go on to play a big part in the deaths of Rachel and, potentially, Chloe herself. So while Nathan is the victim in this scenario, most players who've played the first game won't have much sympathy for him. Regardless of the outcome of the altercation, it's upon its conclusion that Chloe is finally able to enter the school building. When she opens the door, Rachel's already there waiting for her, and she pulls her inside. But before we continue, let's look back at everything that just happened. From the moment Chloe wakes up, it's obvious that she is still preoccupied with the death of her father and, to an almost similar extent, the departure of Max. With nearly all of the adults she encounters before entering the school building, she gets into arguments. There's even a minigame that hinges on Chloe being great at arguing. These so-called backtalks replace the time rewind mechanic from the first game, which in a way means that mouthing off to people is Chloe's version of a superpower. It's not hard to see why, as the people Chloe encounters on her way to school show that she gets plenty of opportunity to practice arguing. Her mother is disappointed with her, David doesn't know how to deal with her, Principal Wells talks down to her from his position of power. Even Miss Grant, Chloe's science teacher, while clearly more sympathetic than some of the other people Chloe encounters, still seems primarily concerned with the question of whether or not Chloe is coming to class. Then there are the other students at Blackwell, some of whom are sympathetic to Chloe, but most of them seem to be in a totally different headspace, preoccupied with things that Chloe can't bring herself to care about. In short, Chloe is still mourning, and it's due to the circumstances aforementioned, as well as the complexity of her grief, that she is out of step with the world around her. Her peers can't understand what she's going through, and most of the adults behave as if it's right about time for Chloe to snap out of her moping and get over it already. But that is not how complicated grief works. It can take many years for someone to process a traumatic event like the one Chloe experienced, and some people can spend their entire lives trying to come to terms with a tragic loss. Yet the modern world doesn't have the patience for this. Life moves on around Chloe. She sees her mother settle for David as her past with William becomes a fading memory. School expects her to do better and seems to no longer even consider her personal circumstances when assessing her dwindling grades and frequent truancy. Hasn't she got enough leeway and sympathy already? It's been 2 years. Life goes on, young lady. It's this whole situation that paints the prison around Chloe. A situation that seems stagnant and hopeless, with the once talented girl appearing destined to be a failure in life. It's important for the player to experience this, to feel that despair, before we witness that one vital moment when Rachel enters Chloe's life and everything changes. When Chloe encounters Rachel at the Blackwell Academy, that's not the first time the player sees Rachel in the flesh. We've already seen her briefly at the rock show in the prologue, but there Chloe and Rachel share about one line of dialogue in a cutscene, shortly after which the scene fades to black and we fast forward to the next morning. Following this event, Chloe is still in disbelief that she, the reject, got to hang out with the most popular kid in school, which helps Rachel retain that aura she had at the start of Life is Strange 1 of being larger than life. On top of that, this build-up towards actually meeting and interacting with Rachel instills into the player the idea that this is a person that should pique our interest. This event is, after all, the major draw of this game and the very reason we are witnessing exactly these couple of days in Chloe's life. Even if our memory of the first Life is Strange is hazy, or we didn't even play it at all, we're being primed to look forward to this inevitable meeting. As Chloe wakes up and makes her way to class, in between all the arguments, the player is constantly reminded that meeting Rachel at the rock show was kind of a big deal. You can find social media posts about it, people at school ask us about her, and Chloe's internal monologue has her questioning whether that night even really happened. We are able to sense Chloe's anticipation and possibly even feel it ourselves. And yet, for some players, it might not have been enough to convince them completely. Over the course of the events of the first game, what is said and revealed about Rachel Amber might not leave players with too good an impression of her. She is revealed to have had relationships behind Chloe's back, withheld truths from her, was involved in the Arcadia Bay drug scene, and you could get the impression that she could at times be rather manipulative. So it's fully possible that as an experienced player, you're already rather skeptical of Rachel and head towards this encounter with an idea of, no way am I letting her get to me. Even if you do buy into the idea that this must be an amazing person we're about to meet, the eventual payoff ought to live up to all this anticipation. The writers fully realize this, and from the moment Chloe actually meets Rachel at school, the latter lays on the charm and she lays it on thick. Despite all the arguments Chloe has had up until this point, Rachel is the first person to stump Chloe and disarm her, not by being critical of her like almost all the other people in Chloe's life, but by being sympathetic to her and considerate. She actually seems to give Chloe energy instead of taking it from her. Rachel is an oasis of love in a desert of sorrow. While this works on the character of Chloe quite visibly, it also has an effect on the player. After all of the negative interactions you've had to guide Chloe through up until that point, Rachel can feel like a breath of fresh air. Here's someone who is genuinely interesting to talk to, this mythical creature from Life is Strange 1 that seems to more than live up to her reputation. The effect is all the greater because it works on a gameplay level. You remember these backtalks where you try to convince people or shut them up by talking a bunch of smack to them? While entertaining, they can also be a bit stressful, as it's possible to fail them, leading to a worse outcome for Chloe. With Rachel, we have none of that. Just like Chloe does, you, the player, can let your guard down. You can just interact with the character and there's nothing you can really do wrong here. That's not to say there's no adventure to be had. Pretty soon after their reunion, Rachel convinces Chloe to sneak out of school. The two jump on a freight train heading to the north, where they talk about their lives and Chloe relays to Rachel her troubles with her mother, David and Max. They then play a game called Two Truths, One Lie, where each girl has to pick the other's lie out of 3 statements about themselves. The player can actually pick these statements and even choose to cheat by telling more truths or lies than the game rules prescribe. This minigame is unwinnable, meaning that no matter what you choose, Rachel will always be able to correctly assess which statements are true and which ones are false. So a conclusion you could draw from this is that Rachel is really good at reading people, and she may have even had her eye on Chloe prior to hanging out at the rock show. The girls then jump off the train at a local park, where a new game already awaits, involving the viewfinders on the overlook. When, after a brief sequence, Chloe gets to one functioning viewfinder to actually work, she and Rachel play an improv game where they spy on park visitors and invent comedic dialogue for them.
And the Lord saith, Thou shalt make a burnt offering of your firstborn son.
Who are you talking to, Dad?
No one, son. Now, lean into the grill and see if the fire started. Further. Further.
Wow, that was dark. Too dark? Perfect dark.
After you've done this a few times, Rachel takes control of the viewfinder and zooms in on a man and a woman standing underneath a tree. While Chloe at first continues to play the game by improvising some lines for them, the two strangers end up kissing and Rachel's entire mood changes from being positive and energetic to being increasingly snarky and standoffish towards Chloe. This is a great example of how Before the Storm, at certain points in the game, makes effective use of what you could call ludonarrative harmony, or in more plain terms, a continuity between the gameplay and the storytelling. In this case, we are presented with a minigame, shortly after having already completed another such game. This suggests to the player that the point of the sequence is that we are going to play a bunch of games with Rachel to get to know her better. The question of why we're even here during school hours has, for most players, probably faded to the background. Then, in the middle of the second game, when we least expect it, we are hit with a major story beat. And now our full focus is on figuring out what just happened and why the mood changed so suddenly. It's a soft misdirection of the player that serves to grant these narrative twists a little more weight. With all of this having happened, the two eventually wander to a nearby junkyard where Chloe ends up confronting Rachel about her attitude, after which the two fight, resulting in Rachel leaving. Chloe, thinking she's screwed up yet another beautiful thing in her life, ends up smashing a bunch of the stuff around her until she is confronted with her deepest trauma and sees the wreck of the car her dad had died in. This whole experience brings Chloe down to the lowest point in the game so far. While the beginning of the day had been unpleasant and full of confrontation, this is the first time we see Chloe truly break down, as the result of having finally been given hope, only to see it snatched away from her. And as the final gut punch, she comes face to face with the very source of all her sorrow. This crisis is the point from which Chloe gets built up again, and where we get to finally learn about the true impact Rachel would go on to have on Chloe's life. This matter is again the central question that Before the Storm must answer. As the sun has set, Chloe reunites with Rachel. Up until then, Rachel had been ambivalent about her reason for ditching school. As it turns out, it's the same reason why her mood changed so suddenly back at the Overlook.
You remember that guy that we saw under this tree with that woman?
The ones who were making out?
That was my dad.
Oh. All right.
And that woman was definitely not my mom.
This big reveal sets us up for the remainder of the game. as the who and why behind the encounter between Rachel's dad, James, and the unknown woman is the major driving force behind most of the big events that are yet to follow. It presents Chloe and Rachel with a crisis over which they can bond and grow closer, making it an event that fulfills the same role as the mystery at the heart of Life is Strange 1, which is of course the disappearance of Rachel Amber. That being said, the conclusion of the sequence already tells us a lot about the characters of Chloe and Rachel and why they end up finding each other, despite being, at first glance, polar opposites. Let's also not forget that the potential social cost of Chloe and Rachel hanging out together is much greater for Rachel, so the question of why Rachel needs Chloe at this point in her life is at least as interesting as vice versa. After all, Rachel could have probably asked just about anyone to ditch school with her and they would have said yes. Yet, she chose Chloe because, as is revealed during the Two Truths, One Lie game, as well as their other conversations, Rachel has a damn good read on Chloe and sees something in her that few other people do. Someone who already has a lot of life experience for her age and isn't so quick to judge when you show a more troubled side of yourself. Because that's exactly what Rachel ends up doing. She shows, be it voluntarily or not, that she can be emotionally vulnerable and even volatile. Had she exposed that side of herself at school, it would have ruined everyone's perfect image of her, damaging her reputation as a result. Sure, Rachel and Chloe had a big fight, but in reconciling, Chloe proved that she can provide Rachel with a safe environment to open up. And if you're a bit more cynical, it was also convenient for Rachel to confide in someone who evidently does not care about the social hierarchy at Blackwall Academy. Conversely, Chloe also learns that she didn't in fact screw up anything this time. This might not sound like a big deal, but if you're a teenager growing up and everyone around you keeps acting like you're the problem, it's all too easy to give in to the impulse of assuming that whenever something goes south, it's probably your fault. You can see this during Chloe's argument with Rachel, where Chloe wants to know what she did wrong. This notion even angers Rachel because she interprets this as Chloe being self-pitying or self-centered, when in fact it is simply a defense mechanism that she was conditioned into using in the face of trouble. Yet the fact that Rachel later actually apologizes to her and reassures her that it wasn't her fault at all could teach Chloe that maybe the whole world isn't out to get her. I'm pretty sure it's the first time in the game that someone actually apologizes to Chloe, so this simple act alone could instill a lot of trust. Once Rachel and Chloe are back on the same page, the first act ends with a fiery climax, when Rachel, in all her rage and sadness about her father's perceived betrayal, inadvertently ends up starting a major forest fire, whose flames can be seen from the town of Arcadia Bay. Where Chapter 1 concluded with a dramatic emotional high that turned the world of our protagonist upside down, the opening scene of the subsequent chapter sees Chloe in a much more familiar setting, in trouble at the principal's office. She is of course being confronted about her truancy the day before, but fortunately for her, she is not alone this time. In the room with her is Rachel, who has to answer for the same crime and is accompanied by both her parents. Chloe's mother Joyce barges in late, having rushed to the meeting directly after her shift at a local diner, even still wearing her work uniform. This contrast and the interaction between the respective parents afterwards is a nod to the class difference at play here. Rachel is from an upper class family. Her father James is the district attorney of Arcadia Bay, and his wife Rose stands by her man as a first lady of sorts. Rachel is supposed to be the product of a man with a squeaky clean image, so she seems out of place in this setting. Meanwhile, Chloe is the daughter of a widowed mother who gave up on her dream of becoming a teacher and works a lower-end job just to make ends meet. The meeting itself is actually one of the more flexible scenarios in the game, as its outcome can be changed depending on both your prior actions and the responses you choose for Chloe during the discussion with Principal Wells. The main decision you'll need to make is whether you'll let Chloe take the fall, in which case she'll get expelled, or go along with Rachel and let her take the brunt of the blame, allowing Chloe to merely get suspended. Since I chose the latter option myself, I'll narrate it from that point of view, but just be aware that some of the variables of what I'm about to tell can be different when other choices are made. As said, Chloe gets suspended from Blackwell, and while this means that she dodges being full-blown expelled, it does come at the cost of Rachel not being allowed to play the lead role of Prospera in Death Knight's performance of the school play. The Tempest by William Shakespeare. Not but a few minutes later though, things get even worse for Chloe. On the school parking lot, the man with the worst sense of timing in all of Arcadia Bay, David Madsen, has some news to share. To put it in military terms, in David's mind, the crisis of Chloe getting suspended is the perfect casus belli for him to announce his plans to move in with Joyce and Chloe. In a further effort to prove that de-escalation is not included in his oversized toolbox, David orders Chloe to empty her pockets in front of him, in an attempt to verify the rumors about her being an habitual pot smoker. You can decide whether Chloe complies or not, but I did just to see Chloe give David the finger. After the high of having spent an entire day with Rachel, Chloe now appears to be back where we found her at the start of the story, defending herself from the accusations of overbearing adults. In one of her more understandable actions in the game, Chloe refuses to go home with David and Joyce. With her privacy violated and David's plan to move in weighing heavily on her mind, she storms off to go back to the junkyard instead. At the junkyard, Chloe comes upon an old truck that she's tempted to smash up at first in order to blow off some steam, but she decides to fix it up instead. This car, as it'll turn out, is destined to become an important part in the dynamic between Chloe and Rachel. From their first real conversation back on the train, the two have openly fantasized about leaving Arcadia Bay. While this idea starts as an idle fantasy, it evolves into a more concrete plan during the events of the game. For Chloe, the reality of David moving in makes it so that home stops feeling like home, whereas Rachel grows increasingly angry over the secret life of her father. Although she is at this point in the story unaware of the true nature of his actions, the knowledge that he plays a different role from the one he pretends to be playing has of itself already awakened in Rachel the unstoppable desire to move away from her current life. Her current life being that of a pretty, well-behaved girl with perfect grades. A role that comes with the praise and admiration of many, but one that she ultimately feels robs her of her agency. For now, Chloe doesn't quite succeed at making the car drive again, but she does get rid of the most glaring visual blemishes. Sometime after, Rachel briefly joins her at the junkyard, which allows her and Chloe to process the events of the past 2 days without the prying eyes of judgmental adults. They then part ways again, with Rachel having to go to the rehearsals of the school play to prep her replacement for the lead role, who, as it happens, is Blackwell's prime social climber, Victoria Chase. Chloe, meanwhile, meets up with her pot dealer Frank, who, without giving her any details, tells her he has an errand for her to run. This, if nothing else, provides Chloe with an opportunity to earn some cash to help make that escape fantasy seem a little less fantastical. While in his RV, Frank reveals that the errand involves Chloe going to the Blackwell dorms and taking back the money that one of the students owes. This student is Drew North, the jock that Chloe had encountered in one of her many arguments the previous day. He sells highly addictive painkillers to his fellow students and owes about a grand to Frank's business associate, Damon Merrick, who is a local criminal that lacks the charm and understanding of the seemingly more benign Frank. While Chloe's recent suspension complicates this errand, Frank figures her presence on campus is still less suspicious than that of a fully grown man driving the video game equivalent of Walter White's crystal ship. Once again, how the next few scenes go down depends on the choices the player makes for Chloe. But in my case, Damon Merrick gets his money back, but Drew's young brother, D&D hero Mikey, breaks his arm and has to go to the hospital. For the most part, the story thread involving Frank's errands serves to set up a bigger story beat later in the game, which we'll get to in due time. In isolation though, this whole ordeal also serves to illustrate that Chloe, in pursuing this desire to escape with Rachel, is already willing to go quite far in taking steps towards making it actually happen. This was, of course, facilitated by the earlier incident with her mother and David, which Chloe perceived as a deep betrayal by her mother, going as far as to accuse Joyce of choosing David over her. Chloe, for the moment, no longer appears to feel any responsibility towards her mother, as is attested to by her potentially criminal actions here, as well as her mostly ignoring Joyce's texts for the remainder of the day. Ultimately though, the errand is a brief detour before we get to possibly the most important moment in establishing Chloe's relationship with Rachel, and with that, a key moment in not just this game, but the series as a whole. That moment being the Tempest. One interesting feature of the school play is that it allows the actors to show a different side of themselves. This is even pointed out to us in-game by Steph, who is the play's stage manager. In high school, kids are often stuck in a certain role. At Blackwell, that's all the more true, but whether they're the rich kid, the nerd, or the troublemaker, the stage provides them with an opportunity to explore and expose a different side to themselves. In a way, this makes them more vulnerable on the account of it being a public performance, but it's also a safe environment. After all, the veil of fiction can act as a shield that protects the actors from being judged too harshly for stepping out of line and not acting in accordance with the normal expectations of their social environment. Unless, they are judged for being theater kids, but that's a different story. The game's writers make excellent use of the artistic freedom that these characters enjoy in their performance of this Shakespearean play, starting with Hayden, who, according to his school bio, auditioned on a dare. But now, while in the backstage area with the play about to start, he's already so into his role that he only wishes to be addressed as his character, Ferdinand. While we are backstage, things take a turn for the grim as we overhear our old nemesis Nathan Prescott getting scolded by his father, Sean. The Prescott family plays a more prominent role in Life is Strange 1, but in the events of Before the Storm, they are already present as a rich and influential family who appear to be in control of much of Arcadia Bay's economy and also have enough of a stake in Blackwell Academy to influence its curriculum. In this scene, Sean Prescott sternly lectures his son, demanding that he do not besmirch the family name by putting in a bad performance. From their conversation, we can deduce that Nathan had made the mistake of sharing his nervousness and insecurity about the play with his dad, who, instead of supporting him, chastises Nathan for, quote, showing weakness. Especially with the knowledge of what Nathan would go on to do in Life is Strange 1, this is a fascinating and foreboding scene. The feelings of self-doubt that Nathan experiences over being seen as the rich kid are dismissed by his father as a show of weakness. The experienced player might conclude that this buildup of forbidden emotions is at least in part what would condemn Nathan to become who he is in Life is Strange 1. Mind that this is a possible explanation and not an excuse of his actions in that game. In any case, this exchange adds an interesting dimension to the character of Nathan, something that was at times hinted at in the original game, but not shown so openly, since this is the first time that we see his father, Sean Prescott, appear in the flesh. It is one of the many examples that shows the writers are hyper-aware of the notion that trauma, especially that which is not allowed to be acknowledged, relieved, or otherwise processed, can help lead its sufferer down some truly dark paths. However, the main draw of the play, both in-game and on a meta level, is the performance of our main characters, Rachel and Chloe. Though, with Rachel having been barred from playing the lead role due to her truancy, it's Victoria Chase's time to shine in a lead role. Except, Victoria appears to be wholly insecure about the ordeal and can easily be persuaded to quit the play. That, or Rachel can just slip her some sleeping pills. Either which way, in order to save the production, the lead role goes back to Rachel. But before the show can start, there are yet more obstacles in the way. For one, stage manager Steph has gone to the hospital to accompany Mikey and Drew, and can as such not oversee the play. To make matters worse, the ongoing forest fire has delayed Juliet, who is to play the role of Ariel. With no other options on the table, Rachel manages to convince her drama teacher, Mr. Keaton, to let Chloe play the role of Ariel, at least until Juliet arrives. A prospect which Chloe accepts with as much enthusiasm as you'd expect.
Damn it.
With this impromptu change to the cast, Chloe, and by extension you, the player, is given just a few moments to rehearse the lines of the play. I personally consider this moment to be the greatest demonstration of Deck 9's writing ability, both in Before the Storm and really any game by them that I've played. They essentially pull the same trick that they did during the viewfinder scene, but to even greater effect. By letting the player read the script with highlighted bits of dialogue, it makes them feel like they really ought to learn these lines. And unless you go out of your way to screenshot several pages of dialogue, or happen to have been traumatized enough in literature class to actually know these lines by heart, this is a genuine challenge. By video game standards, there is quite a lot of text to go through, and you can actually mess up your lines. In a video game series where, at any given moment, picking one dialogue option over another can drastically alter the outcome of the events that follow, most players will be afraid to screw things up here. Who knows, maybe getting the lines wrong will ruin the entire play, Rachel and Chloe will grow apart, and we're back to square one. The funny part is, though, which dialogue you end up picking ultimately does not matter one bit. Sure, if you mess up your lines, it'll make the drama teacher sweat buckets, but all of the options lead to the same climax of the play, where Rachel suddenly goes off script to talk to Chloe directly, on stage, through the veneer of her character, to discuss their future together. Chloe goes along with it, and as Mr. Keaton puts it, it's magical. To fully appreciate this scene, we'll need a little background on the actual Shakespearean play they're performing. In The Tempest, Prospero is an exiled duke from Milan, who now lives on an island with his daughter Miranda. For the Blackwell production of the play, he's been gender swapped to Prospera, due to being played by either Rachel or her understudy Victoria. A link between Prospero and Rachel is already established in Chapter 1 of the game. While playing Two Truths, One Lie with Chloe on the train, Rachel refers to her residence in Arcadia Bay as a heinous exile, hoping to one day return to California, where she's from. In The Tempest, Prospero uses magic to control the spirit Ariel, who in this production is now played by Chloe. During the scene that Rachel and Chloe are playing, the original script dictates that Prospero promises Ariel her impending release from his service. Yet Rachel, as Prospera, decides to go off script, yet continues to speak in Shakespearean English in order to maintain to the audience the illusion that she is still in character, while she is in reality speaking directly to Chloe, imploring her to stay with her in their adventure. Chloe responds in the same fashion, confirming her willingness to be with Rachel, Prospera, but also expressing her desire for stability, that she does not want their connection to merely hinge on the excitement of their future exploits. To the audience, Ariel agrees to stay with Prospera for a while longer than the script indicates, while Rachel and Chloe know that they've just promised each other to go forth into the future in unison. This pivotal scene operates on many layers, and it working so well is a testament to the abilities of Deck 9's writing team at the time. While at first it might just seem like a veiled declaration of love, there's also a deep underlying tragedy. In improvising their own conclusion to the original script, Rachel and Chloe's characters break free from the fate bestowed upon them centuries ago by Shakespeare. No longer his pawns, they head into a brighter future together. But as the player, we know that Rachel and Chloe are themselves stuck in the tragedy that is Life is Strange. The contract they enter during their off-script moment, though sincere, is already destined to end in a very grim manner. With Before the Storm being a mere prequel to Life is Strange, their fate was already sealed the moment they met. Rachel and Chloe were able to claim their agency within Shakespeare's play, but what they do not know is that they are living in a doomed world. Their lives are themselves a story, the ending to which has already been written. The emotional impact on the player is all the greater because, in anticipation of the scene, we were made to focus on the hassle of rehearsing the play's lines, once again being fooled into thinking that the chance for an optimal outcome would hinge on our perfect execution of this segment as gamers. Even more so than with the viewfinder segment, this opens us up for the impact of the scene, which, even at face value, is probably the most emotionally moving sequence in the entire game. It's one of those scenes that confirms that this is a story that is enhanced by being told within a video game, and not hindered by it like so many other potentially great video game stories. The medium enhances the emotional punch of the major story beats, and I cannot stress enough just how rare this actually is. Following the play, Chloe and Rachel walk home together. Elated, they discuss their performance, and caught up in all the emotion, Rachel proposes to Chloe that they leave Arcadia Bay that very night. Chloe is hesitant, but Rachel eventually convinces her to go along with the plan, being very persuasive and almost demanding in the process. I've seen this be interpreted as a clear allusion to Rachel's more manipulative side, something that is hinted towards both before and after the sequence, and it's sometimes even used as evidence of Rachel being completely egotistical and just using Chloe to realize her own fantasies. In the end, these scenes appear to have been purposefully written to contain a fair dose of ambiguity, so I don't think that any interpretation is inherently right or wrong, but I do tend to look at this event with a little more nuance. While Rachel and Chloe share the desire to leave Arcadia Bay, the way they envision this escape differs quite a bit. This is because, in the end, this escape fantasy is a symbol for wishing to leave behind their old lives. And since Rachel and Chloe are from notably different backgrounds and are thus running away from different things, the freedom they seek represents something unique to both of them. Rachel envisions a life where she makes good on her unbridled potential, where she has complete agency and the outside world can no longer dictate how she should behave. Chloe, meanwhile, wants away from the disheartening reality of her home situation, where, in her perception, her mother has repressed the memory of her father in order to settle with a complete ass of a man. Chloe also comes from a household that's felt chaotic and unstable ever since her dad died, and she seems to want nothing more than a stable environment with someone who loves her unconditionally. This conflict echoes what Rachel and Chloe told each other on stage while in character. Rachel wants excitement, while Chloe desires peace. In a sense, they want what the other has. It actually makes quite a bit of sense that, as they walk through that quiet street in Arcadia Bay, Rachel insists that they make their break that very night, whereas Chloe is more hesitant. At this point in the story, we've already seen that Rachel is someone who easily gets swept up by the energy of the moment. It's also quite obvious that this is a girl who, due to her looks and talents, has over the course of her young life probably not heard the word no a whole lot. Chloe, meanwhile, has all kinds of practical considerations. This makes sense because she is from a relatively poor single-parent household. Some of the basics of starting a new life, such as a vehicle and money, aren't things that she takes for granted. Chloe also still feels responsibility towards her mother, knowing that Joyce has gone through much of the same grief that she has herself. She is only able to distance herself from this sense of responsibility because she feels that her mother has chosen David over her, ultimately making the prospect of an uncertain life with Rachel seem much more attractive than being an unwanted presence in her own home. It's yet another example of how the writers are aware that emotionally impactful experiences, especially at an early age, can inform future behaviors in people. In the case of Chloe, she appears to be plagued by guilt and self-doubt due to the course of her life up until that point, and the trauma that's been inflicted upon her. Rachel, on the other hand, gives the impression that she feels powerful enough to take on the entire world. And even though her desire to escape was sparked by the secretive actions of her father, it was in his stable household that she was empowered to dream so boldly in the first place. While Rachel and Chloe do eventually agree upon a course of action, which is to say, immediate escape, it matters little in the end. When they sneak into Rachel's home to pick up some clothes and other essentials, they're almost immediately spotted by Rachel's parents, and the two would-be escapees can't help but get roped into having dinner with them. Their plan is then to just postpone their escape until later that night, but during dinner, Rachel has a complete meltdown when her father does his usual district attorney moral grandstanding, and she confronts him about the strange woman she saw him kiss at the Overlook the other day. This prompts her father, James, to reveal that the woman is in fact Rachel's birth mother. And with this cliffhanger, the second act of Before the Storm draws to a close. When it comes to the third and final act of Before the Storm, this is one of the parts of the game that I've come to appreciate a bit more in subsequent playthroughs. Initially, I felt that the performance of the Tempest near the end of Act 2, where the relationship between Rachel and Chloe reaches its zenith, is the part where Before the Storm fulfills its original promise of showing us why Rachel was such an important person in Chloe's life. This question is now easily answered, with us having witnessed Rachel help drag Chloe out of the mire of her stagnant grief. The final act, therefore, seemed to me like it existed merely to tie up loose story threads, particularly the one involving Rachel's dad, and to definitively tie the events of Before the Storm to what would come to pass in Life is Strange 1. The issue being here that the mystery surrounding James Amber, at least to me, seems a whole lot less interesting than the interaction between Chloe and Rachel, with this big mystery serving mostly as a vehicle to drive the plot forward. In my more recent playthroughs, I've come to appreciate this final act more, as it actually gives us quite a bit more insight into Rachel Amber's enigmatic mind. It brings us closer to that more implicit question that Before the Storm raises, a reversal of its main thesis: why did Rachel need Chloe? The third act still has its issues, which I will get to, but it is more than worth to dive into the main beats of the final chapter of the story. For the first scene of this act, James Amber, flanked by his wife Rose, gives Rachel the story behind his reveal that Rose is not her biological mother. Rachel insists that Chloe be by her side to hear this story, and so James begins to tell both of them the circumstances surrounding Rachel's birth. The mysterious woman who's been spotted around Arcadia Bay recently and who is Rachel's real mother is called Sarah Gerhardt. She was James's high school sweetheart, with him describing her as the girl that every boy at school was in love with, so he couldn't quite believe it when she picked him. The two got into a relationship, but James soon noticed that he couldn't keep up with Sarah, who appeared to possess an insatiable need for excitement, which eventually resulted in substance abuse. James had hoped that the birth of their child, Rachel, would help Sarah slow down a little. This was the case at first, but Sarah soon spiraled into full-blown addiction, which James says put the infant Rachel in dangerous situations. James eventually took a radical decision and chose to protect his daughter, cutting off Sarah entirely to prevent her from being able to hurt their baby any longer. Since then, James has been writing Sarah monthly checks to support her financially, under the condition that she does not seek contact with her daughter. In this scene, the exposition about Sarah is fascinating, first of all because of the chosen method. In a metaphorical callback, Rachel and Chloe use the viewfinder from the first chapter to see different scenes from James and Sarah's life play out, putting a cap on the mystery they'd uncovered the first time they used the viewfinder. But what's even more striking about it is how many parallels there are between Sarah and Rachel. Rachel's case, at least at this point in the story, is not quite as extreme as that of her mother's, but players will have noticed how the energy of Rachel can sometimes be difficult to contain, with her setting course for a radical new path in life seemingly on a whim. What James reveals here about Rachel's background could potentially even give some insight into why she sometimes acts in such a manner. Even though the events involving Sarah would have happened too early in Rachel's life for her to have stored any memories of it, there is research that shows that experiencing unsafety and uncertainty can in fact be registered at such an early age. As infants, we constantly absorb information from our parents, and if that information is inconsistent, negative, or otherwise disruptive, it can prime us for certain behaviors. If you're not sure whether your mother is going to feed you in time, maybe you'll learn that you have to try and exercise control over your environment so that you get what you need. What looks like manipulation to some might in reality simply be an imprinted survival mechanism. I definitely want to stress that this is mostly speculation on my behalf, as the only concrete thing Rachel says to this effect is that she has always felt that something was wrong or missing from her life. This sentiment is sometimes found in adopted children, and it alludes to what I've just explained. There is no concrete proof that what I said about early childhood experience was something envisioned by the writers, rather than a purely speculative observation on my behalf. I do want to include it though, as it provides a possible nuance to the oft-debated question of whether Rachel is a pure-hearted doe, corrupted by her environment, or an evil manipulator who uses everybody around her. This reading also fits the more overt theme of the game, where the characters do have agency, but sometimes make decisions informed by complex psychological mechanisms that they themselves have no knowledge of. Overwhelmed by the information relayed to her, Rachel goes to her room, and she is soon joined by Chloe, who eventually gets her to open up about what she's feeling. While Rachel understandably feels broken by the news, she expresses a strong desire to meet Sarah. Earlier, James had already told Chloe that this could not happen, as he believes that Sarah can still cause tremendous harm to all those around her, including Rachel. Yet, the desire to know where we come from is one of the most fundamental aspects of the human experience. This, paired with Rachel's full speed ahead personality, makes it so that neither Chloe nor Rachel shows any intention of following this fatherly advice. Sarah came to Arcadia Bay to reconnect with her daughter, and that feeling of being so wanted is something that, in spite of any potential risks, Rachel cannot simply ignore. Chloe finally sneaks back into her own house early the next day. The first thing she does is call her dealer Frank. Chloe had seen Sarah leave his RV the day before, and she convinces Frank to set up a meeting with her at the junkyard that afternoon. In the meantime, we can start to see the effect that Rachel's presence is having on Chloe's life. In a stark contrast with the previous times we witnessed Chloe in her own home, Chloe is noticeably upbeat. She dyes a strand of her hair blue, she tries on new fashion, and she looks into the mirror with more confidence and presumably more self-love than before. Note that Chloe's problems didn't disappear. In fact, she's probably got even more on her mind than before. She is still suspended from school, David now lives in the same household, and she's bearing the responsibility of finding Rachel's birth mother. Still, the important takeaway here is the shift in her disposition. For the first time in ages, Chloe is actually looking towards the future again, instead of being stuck in the seemingly endless emotional malady that followed her separation from her father and her best friend. And this is actually a common way that you move on from grief, especially the complicated grief that Chloe appears to experience. It's not something that happens overnight, but gradually. It can take months or even years, but there comes a day where you gather the courage to look forward into the future. That doesn't mean that you don't still frequently think about the source of your grief, nor that you won't experience off days where you once again feel hopeless. It's a slow process, but if you can accept that, you'll regain the confidence that maybe, one day, things will be alright again. The catalyst of that growth differs per individual. Some people do a lot of soul searching, and they find an inner peace that unfolds slowly until it permeates their being. In Chloe's case, she meets a person who fills a void that she's felt for so long. Not only does she receive the love and validation she's felt starved of over the past years, but she also feels imbued with a new purpose in life. If you were to express it through a metaphor, it's as if Chloe was released from a trap in the middle of the woods. That doesn't mean she's quite out of the woods yet, but she can now reasonably expect to make it to safety eventually. On her way out of the house, Chloe sees Joyce and David, who seem to be genuinely happy together. The two talk with Chloe, and David even apologizes to Chloe for making her empty her pockets on the school parking lot the other day. David goes on to show Chloe a photograph from his military service in Iraq, depicting him and his fellow soldier and best friend Phil. He goes on to tell her that Phil got killed by an IED while serving, and that this loss still weighs heavily on him. David wants Chloe to hold on to the photo for him, which the player can choose to accept or decline. It goes without saying that this scene corresponds with the game's, by now, well-established theme of trauma informing certain character behaviors. But what makes this instance particularly interesting is that the technique was used to humanize one of the more unlikable and one-dimensional characters from the original Life is Strange. Mind that, even if we isolate David's actions in Before the Storm, his peace offering doesn't quite excuse him, as he says and does some downright stupid and insensitive things to Chloe. But it does add a bit of texture to a character that had, up until this point, been super easy to dismiss wholesale. With Chloe back at the junkyard, we are now firmly within reach of wrapping up the story. But a lot of things are still set to take place. Chapter 3 is by far the most action-heavy part of the game, and not always for the better, as the speed at which the events follow one another makes it more logistics-heavy and gamey. Not everything seems to happen because it flows naturally from the motivations of each character, but sometimes it's like the story needs certain things to go down in a specific way just to drive the plot where the writers need it to be. At the junkyard, Chloe has a second stab at making the truck actually drive again, and this time she succeeds. While she still enjoys yet another little victory in life, Rachel arrives on the scene, followed by Frank a few minutes later. Except Frank didn't bring along Sarah for a teary-eyed reunion, but his menacing associate, Damon Merrick, who demands to know why two teenage girls are asking so many questions about Frank's clients. After a verbal argument, the fight turns physical, which culminates in Damon stabbing Rachel in the arm, causing her to bleed badly. Although Damon seems fully intent on finishing the job, he is stopped by Frank, which allows Chloe to get Rachel into her newly fixed truck and rush her to the hospital. After a brief cutscene, which also sees Rachel's parents, James and Rose, barge into the hospital to be with their daughter, James walks up to Chloe in the waiting room. He informs her that Rachel has undergone surgery but that she's going to be okay. At his request, Chloe tells James what happened, and James appears to be aware of both Damon and Frank being part of the Arcadia Bay drug scene. With this conversation concluded, Chloe can now choose to visit Mikey and even play an extra round of D&D with him, Steph and Drew. Chloe then makes her way to Rachel, as the reality dawns upon the player that 30-something-year-old Damon Merrick managed to put not one, but two teenagers in the hospital this weekend. What can I say, the saddest loser of Arcadia Bay rotating trophy is hotly contested this time of year. On our way to Rachel, we can also overhear two firemen, who discuss how the forest fire suddenly and without explanation went out, further tying said fire to Rachel's temperament. When talking to Rachel in her hospital room, Chloe already discusses the next course of action with her. Rachel suggests that Chloe break into her father's office to try and find Sarah's number before she leaves Arcadia Bay. It's moments like this where I take issue with the speed at which the gears are turning. because even with Rachel dead set on meeting Sarah and Chloe feeling so responsible that she wants to help in any way she can, this degree of targets fixation seems a little too extreme for two teenage girls who have just had a brush with death as a result of pursuing that very goal. Regardless, Chloe leaves the hospital to make a last-ditch effort to try and find Sarah. On her way out, she runs into Elliot, who is there to visit Mikey. Now, I haven't talked about Elliot a whole lot, and that's because his impact on the story so far has been minimal. In Chloe's own words, she and Elliot hooked up for a while shortly after her father's death, but what this hooking up actually entailed isn't all that clear. What is clear from Chloe's interactions with Elliot during the events of Before the Storm is that Elliot is quite obviously in love with Chloe, but Chloe isn't all that into him. Although Chloe appears to be much more interested in women romantically speaking, she does mention in the original Life is Strange that she went through a boy toy phase. Before the Storm's lead writer, Zach Garris, mentioned one time that Elliot was written into the story to represent this boy toy phase. But given how Chloe's communication with Elliot seems to occupy only the margin between apathy and outright rejection, it appears as though said phase has been over for quite a while by the time the events of Before the Storm take place. This disinterest cannot only be clarified through Chloe's orientation, but also the fact that Elliot ultimately does not really have anything to offer her. He appears to be a well-performing student with no real issues, though not yet in possession of a strong character nor substantial amount of life experience. It's clear that Elliot cannot help Chloe move past her grief because he does not truly understand it. In a way, he's just there to take advantage of it. What I do like about these interactions is that the writers always manage to implicate the player in Chloe's discomfort. Whenever Elliot pitches one of his half-hearted requests to go on a date, you're only able to either reject him outright or give him a non-committal maybe. As soon as Chloe manages to engage in her tradition of rejecting Elliot in a non-confrontational way, she heads to James Amber's office in pursuit of Sarah's whereabouts. While in his office, Chloe can uncover numerous items that more than undermine the version of events that James had relayed to her and Rachel the night before. For one, it turns out that Sarah had for months declined James's payments, and that she has been sending a bunch of letters to Rachel, though James intercepted all of them and never saw fit to tell his daughter. Further correspondence confirms that Sarah went to rehab and that she has been clean for over a year, and is, according to her lawyer, well within her legal right to see her daughter. Things take a turn yet more grim when Chloe finds James's secret phone, which reveals that he has hired none other than Damon Merrick to take care of Sarah. The exact outcome that James envisioned when he entered this more than dubious agreement with Damon is purposefully vague, but given the criminal's reputation, it's obvious that James would, or at least should have known, that Damon would potentially kill Sarah. That Sarah is in mortal danger becomes clear soon after, when Chloe, pretending to be James, texts with Damon and she's shown a picture of Sarah tied up in a chair. As it turns out, James and Damon have made an arrangement where, in exchange for Damon taking care of Sarah, James, who I should remind you is Arcadia-based district attorney, is to pay Damon a hefty sum of cash in addition to destroying evidence that ties the criminal to an ongoing murder case. After winning Damon's trust over text, Chloe finds out that Sarah is being held at the burned out remains of the old lumber mill, which was also the location of the rock show in the game's prologue. Just as she's about to leave the Amber residence to make her way towards the lumber mill, Elliot enters the room. As it turns out, our friend-zoned nice guy actually followed Chloe after their latest awkward meeting at the hospital. He ends up cornering Chloe, physically preventing her from leaving the room, and gives her a big speech about how Rachel is manipulating her and how he is the only person who truly cares about her. It's an uncomfortable scene that Chloe can get out of by calling 911, and regardless of whether she succeeds in making the emergency services arrive on the scene without Elliot noticing, Chloe seizes her chance to escape and make her way towards the old lumber mill. I've pondered about the meaning of this interaction for a while, but it remains one of the more puzzling moments in the story in regards to its purpose. I think it tries to communicate that when you're in a vulnerable position, not everyone who tries to help you has your best interest in mind. And it's good to be wary of those people who seem a little too eager to make your troubles go away. Though within the full context of the scene in James's office, where Chloe's success depends on her finding a few too many conveniently placed clues, the escalation with Elliot seems a bit much. I don't know, let me know what you think in the comments, if you have a better idea of what you think the purpose of this interaction is in relation to the bigger narrative. In any case, Chloe is free to go to the lumber mill where her final confrontation with Damon Merrick awaits. Though Damon seems a little impressed that Chloe managed to finesse him into giving up the location of Sarah to a 16-year-old girl, he still knocks her unconscious so he can continue to wrap up his end of the bargain with James by taking care of Sarah, which in Damon's world means that he tries to make her OD. Frank, still wounded from their last confrontation, shows up once again to take on Damon, presumably killing him this time. When Chloe regains consciousness, she finds herself set opposite Sarah. The two talk about Rachel, and while Chloe encourages Sarah to meet with her estranged daughter, Sarah says that it cannot be, and that Chloe must not reveal to Rachel what her father did to keep Sarah away from her. Even though James effectively attempted to have Sarah killed, Sarah seems, to a degree, understanding, calling him a desperate man who does whatever he deems necessary to protect his daughter. She tells Chloe that if the truth about the agreement between James and Damon were to ever come out, Chloe would effectively be killing Rachel's father for her. For the final scene, we find Chloe back in Rachel's hospital room. There we get presented with a choice to either tell Rachel the convenient lie that Chloe could not find Sarah, or we can tell her the devastating truth about what her father tried to do to Rachel's birth mother. With this choice, the game reaches its conclusion, and we see the consequences of her final choice in the cutscene that follows. Before we move on to the conclusion of this video, I'd like to take one little detour that's relevant to the central point of this project. At certain points throughout the entire game, we get to experience lifelike dreams that Chloe has about her father, William. These dreams provide an excellent insight into Chloe's inner struggle, but I've avoided talking about them up until this point. These dream sequences are sprinkled throughout the story, and instead of making random segues into each one when it comes up chronologically, I figured I'd catch them all at once and see what they add to the story as it's already been established. As is revealed across Life is Strange 1 and reiterated in Before the Storm, William Price, Chloe's dad, died in an accident when he was on his way to pick up Joyce from the grocery store. A semi-truck slammed into his car and that was that. And, as we've established in this video, the emotional impact of this loss on Chloe is one of the main driving forces of the game's narrative. For one part, the dreams that Chloe has about William help us visualize this emotional baggage. These visions at times appear ethereal and even beautiful, but carry a dark and foreboding undertone throughout. All of the dreams involve William being in or around a car, and knowing how that marriage ends, as a player you are waiting for the inevitable catastrophe to hit us. For the other part, these dream sequences reveal a lot about Chloe's inner struggles. These include not just as of yet unprocessed emotions regarding her dad's accident itself, but also more recent issues in her life. Her fight with Rachel, the fear of David replacing her father, her having to fix up the truck, they all make appearances in her dreams. When you put it simply, Chloe's dreams are an inventory of sorts, showing us the things that weigh on our mind in that moment, whether they concern something that just happened to her or events from a now distant past. In the dreams, Chloe has conversations with her father, who gives her advice on how to move forward, often cloaked in metaphor. Then there's the last dream, which is not actually a dream at all, as William appears to Chloe in broad daylight as she is driving to the old lumber mill and nearly gets hit by a truck. Overlooking the burned forest, William sheds some light on the situation with Rachel and her father, saying that sometimes parents choose to lie to their children because they fear the truth is so ugly that it will tear a rift between them. This sequence differs from the earlier ones, not only because Chloe appears to be fully awake this time, but the scene also does not contain any of the visceral or shocking aspects that were present in all of the prior dreams. Perhaps even more tellingly, William finally acknowledges that he is dead and can no longer tell Chloe anything she does not know. Whether these are actual, spiritual manifestations of William from beyond the grave, or they are Chloe's way of assessing the problems in her life by visualizing fatherly advice that she can no longer get in real life, that question is left open to the interpretation of each player. I personally do prefer the second option, as the symbology in the final meeting with William suggests that Chloe is finally accepting her father's death, albeit through him.
Ready as I'll ever be.
Problem is, I'm dead. So how am I supposed to tell you anything?
Chloe's growth in this moment is further represented through the burnt down forest, which by itself is already an established metaphor for change and rebirth, but is also directly hinted at earlier in the game when Chloe is being lectured by her schoolmate Evan about the dangers of forest fires. During that exchange, Chloe is her usual contrarian self, as she suggests that fire is awesome. Evan actually agrees though, saying that fires are an important part of the ecosystem, and that certain trees cannot even grow without the occasional presence of extreme temperatures. So when Chloe is overlooking a still smoldering forest near the end of the game, it is no stretch to conclude that this setting represents Chloe's transformation. She had to meet Rachel, who is herself closely associated with fire, in order to become reborn, and finally have the courage to look towards the future once more. Against the backdrop of this layered metaphor, the idea that William's presence in his final scene represents the start of a new chapter in Chloe's life is all the more convincing, not to mention striking. I wanted to dedicate a special chapter to these dreams because they represent a strong visualization of how Chloe processes her grief, and how this changes the way she faces the more urgent problems in her life. They're also really well integrated into the game, because seeing the same mundane gameplay elements that Life is Strange is known for implemented into a surreal, dreamlike world gives the scenes a sort of uncanny feeling. Even Chloe's text messages and diary entries change during these dreams. The dreams are also among the game's content that grew on me the most as I replayed the game and my perspective on life had changed. Don't get me wrong, I've always loved the dream sequences, but at first I considered these scenes to be aesthetically interesting representations of Chloe's personal trauma. It wasn't until much later that I realized that these dreams can actually be a very real aspect of the type of grief process that Chloe appears to be going through. Without going into too much detail, as that's not the point of this video, I've experienced them myself. And yes, the dreams in Before the Storm do take a fair amount of poetic freedom with just how grounded and meaningful they are. But the phenomenon of such hyper-realistic stress dreams can manifest within the context of complicated grief or conditions such as PTSD. I call them stress dreams rather than nightmares, because while they can at times be visceral and terrifying, they are not often exclusively cruel in nature, but at least in part also transformative. I also want to stress, this doesn't mean that I buy into the idea that the specific events in dreams in general hold specific meaning. But seeing certain people in your dreams until you've processed the events involving them can be a way in which your subconsciousness participates in mourning. All of this made me appreciate Chloe's dreams of William even more. They are not just rich in meaningful symbology and integrated tastefully into the gameplay, but they draw on an actual phenomenon, which can help some parts of the audience, myself included, relate to Chloe even more. They are scenes subject to dramatization, but sufficiently grounded in reality to enhance our understanding of Chloe in a tangible way. When it was first announced, there were many reasons to be skeptical of Before the Storm. A prequel to Life is Strange, there were many things it could have done to ruin the magic that Dontnod's beloved original brought to the table. Looking back on Before the Storm now, many years since its release, it emerges as a game that is, in many ways, stronger than Life is Strange 1. While the original game did amazing work in bringing us Arcadia Bay, one of the all-time greatest video game settings, and it also introduced us to some iconic characters, including Chloe and Rachel, it was Before the Storm that added a lot of depth to the mythos of this magical Oregon town. It makes sense too. The legwork of introducing us to the Life is Strange universe and selling us on the game's mechanics and storytelling techniques had already been done by the time Deck 9 started to work on A Tale of Their Own. They were also able to pull a lot of threads that were sometimes dangled in front of us in Life is Strange 1, but did not always get followed up on, be it due to a lack of time or the fact that the original game had a different focus, leaning much more into the supernatural implications of the setting. For examples of such narrative threads, think of the shifting family dynamic that David Madsen brought to the Price household, or the way in which Chloe and Max had lost contact prior to their reunion at the start of Life is Strange 1. Before the Storm also contains a ton of smaller revelations about the first game. We can see how Chloe got her truck, and we can learn more about how and why Frank got his dog, Pompidou. While the answers to such questions are inconsequential to the bigger picture, they do highlight that this prequel was a conscious effort to strengthen the fundament of Life is Strange 1, instead of fulfilling the pre-release fears that Before the Storm would detract from the original. Key to this is that compared to the original, the writing in Before the Storm is, in my view, a lot better on average. Bluntly put, when you look at the plot, there is a lot less that actually happens in Before the Storm, which allows us to breathe and actually interact with the characters a little more without having to worry about potentially rewinding time or rushing towards the next high-stakes objective. In fact, the moment in the middle of Act 3 when we do get caught in a current of shocking events that follow each other in rapid succession happens to also be the moment where the writing and flow of the story suffer the most. In addition to having a story with a tighter focus, Before the Storm also features dialogue that appears to have been written much better and closer to the characters than in Life is Strange 1. I don't know whether this is because of a different focus, or Deck 9 as an American studio just being much closer to the culture it's aiming to portray, but the characters in Before the Storm feel like they speak, for the most part, in a way that people in their position would. I've seen people complain that Chloe can be cringy and angsty, but she's a 16-year-old girl with studded armbands. Like, how is she not going to be both of those things? In literature, this is called verisimilitude, where in this case the dialogue is plausible and believable within the context of the story. Even when this believability does not apply and the dialogue seems unrealistic, it is often to convey a certain idea on a more meta level. Principal Raymond Wells speaks like he swallowed a thesaurus in order to communicate to the player that he is distant from the students and is unable to connect with them on any meaningful level. Or we have Mr. Keaton, Rachel's drama teacher, who produces needlessly wordy prose whenever he opens his mouth. It's not that a principal or a drama teacher would actually talk like this in real life, rather, this is what people like this sounded to us when we were kids trying to make it through high school. Though we are already wrapping up this video, I chose to elaborate on the writing a bit because it shows the greatest weapon of Deck 9's arsenal and the reason why they proved able, for the most part, to tackle each of the challenges they faced when they accepted this project. To reiterate, Rachel's presence in this game was a source of controversy prior to its release. Some fans feared that interacting with Rachel in a more mundane manner would ruin the mystique. But by presenting her character in a way that balances this mystique with a deeper understanding of her personality, Deck 9 managed to retain her mysterious nature while possibly adding even more weight to the blow of her eventual death in Life is Strange 1. By showing to us just how much ambition and potential Rachel had, the knowledge that her life will be snuffed out before any of it can be fulfilled strikes us as the series' ultimate tragedy. The myth of Rachel Amber was kept intact and much more than that. Then there's Chloe, who was by some perceived as too angsty to carry the main role of a subsequent game. I remember seeing a random internet comment following the announcement of Before the Storm that said something to the tune of, "Oh great, they're taking the most annoying character from Life is Strange and giving her her own game." While that statement does seem like a stretch of itself, it does hint towards Chloe not having charmed everyone by the end of the original game. Now, again, I'm not gonna say that Chloe isn't angsty in Before the Storm, in places she might be even more so, but because her angst is contextualized more clearly as the defense mechanism of a traumatized teen, it is easier to understand and can to some even be endearing rather than annoying or obnoxious. Chloe truly shines in Before the Storm. It has been confirmed by lead writer Zach Garris that in preparation of the project, the team did thorough psychological research to figure out how a girl like Chloe might behave in the wake of a devastating trauma. And it shows. In this game, Chloe feels real. She responds to scrutiny with the uncompromising emotional intensity that many kids display at her age. As she's caught in an as of yet incomplete mourning process, the stress that she experiences from the world expecting her to just get over it and move on is probably something you might have felt were you ever misfortunate enough to have been in Chloe's position at one point in your life. Though the best part of the writing is that it remains always in service to telling an interesting story. At no point does it seem like Chloe's trauma, or indeed the trauma of any other people like David, Nathan or Rachel, is being rubbed in your face in an effort to get some cheap emotional thrill out of you, or to absolve these characters of the responsibility of their actions. This trauma-informed dynamic is subtle enough that you might go through the entire game being mostly unaware of it, but on a guttural level, you still feel like you can relate to Chloe, Rachel, or maybe one of the other characters, but you can't quite figure out why. Make no mistake though, this subtext was put there consciously. Even an inexcusable character in the game like James is given a proper context and motivation to act in the way he does. This doesn't mean that what he did to almost cause the death of his daughter's mother isn't horrifying, but it is possible to see how, in his mind, he probably thought he was doing the right thing. Ironically, this thorough approach to humanize each character does prevent Before the Storm from being the perfect prequel. When you play the two games back to back in their chronological order, so starting with Before the Storm and ending with Life is Strange 1, you can notice a dissonance between the two. In Life is Strange 1, many of the characters have been purposefully written as one-dimensional, with some of them becoming more dynamic as the events of the story progress. This is essentially what happens in Before the Storm as well, but Before the Storm does this with much more nuance. In that game, characters already start out with a little more texture to them, and across the game, the way that characters typically grow closer is by an increase in understanding of each other's struggles. In Life is Strange 1, this understanding tends to follow in the wake of catastrophic events. Even then, plenty of characters end up feeling like they lack substance, which might also be an unforeseen consequence of Life is Strange 1 simply having many more characters that you can interact with. Be that as it may, it becomes impossible to miss this mismatch when you start to compare some of the characters that are in both games. David's character growth during Before the Storm apparently gets completely reset when Life is Strange 1 rolls around, where he's back to being an insufferable, potentially abusive ass with a chip on his shoulder. Nathan, whom in Before the Storm we can help grow closer to his girlfriend Samantha, adding perhaps a little more levity to his life, is irredeemably ruined in Life is Strange 1. Making our efforts seem pointless. Even Chloe herself seems to have grown more as a person than Life is Strange retroactively gives her credit for. On a meta level, there is a pretty glaring mismatch between the two games. On one side we have Life is Strange 1, an adherent of chaos theory. It's a game that teaches us that small actions can inspire radical changes to how life plays out. On the other side we have Before the Storm, where our choices can alter the life trajectories of some of the characters in ways that feel significant. Yet we are to believe that, in the end, no matter which choices we make, they all lead into the same static set of circumstances that we see at the start of Life is Strange 1. You can of course pretend, as I sometimes do, that Before the Storm is its own game, and that Life is Strange is but one of the many possible scenarios that can result from it. Yet many of the events in Before the Storm, such as the performance of the Tempest, lose part of their meaning when they aren't tied to the dark fate that we know awaits Rachel. Mind that this is neither game's fault. Life is Strange 1 was, of course, created without any expectation of it ever getting a prequel, and without any knowledge of the focus on trauma-informed subtext and symbolism that Tech 9 would choose to put in their game. Before the Storm, meanwhile, was created to add a different twist to a familiar setting, focusing less on supernatural powers and exciting set pieces and more on the psychological workings of the main characters. That the writers of Before the Storm turned out to have such a good grasp on character motivation and development that they ended up not perfectly matching the markedly different original material is a sin that can be forgiven. And that's just what I'll do. Before the Storm is an amazing and creative take on the subject material that the original Life is Strange brought into our world. It's a transformative experience, carried by the writer's deep understanding of the effects of trauma and other past experiences on our personality, our decision-making, and ultimately, our destiny. But it also teaches us that, in the end, people aren't defined by what they've been through. Chloe ultimately finds back the agency to emerge from the dire fields of her grief, perhaps stronger than ever. Turns out she just needed a spark to relight that fire. So, that will conclude my video for today. If you've made it this far, truly thank you for bearing with me. I know this was a long one. It's the result of hundreds of hours of work and actual years worth of thinking about a lot of these topics, understanding them, and finally reaching a point where I felt confident enough that I could relay all of this information to you in a hopefully coherent manner. Believe it or not, but there are plenty of things I didn't even get to touch on. There's a whole additional chapter to Before the Storm that follows Max and Chloe on the day that William dies, but I felt like discussing this heart-wrenching epilogue would not have added much to my thesis that wasn't already there. I also didn't even get to mention how the soundtrack of Before the Storm might be my favorite score of any video game. It contains a bunch of songs by the indie folk band Daughter, specifically written for this game and often featuring lyrics delivered from the perspective of Chloe. Definitely worth checking out. If you have never played this game before, let me know if I explained all of it well enough. And if you did play it, tell me if I helped expand your appreciation of a game you perhaps loved already. Even though many of the themes I discuss may seem evident now that I've pointed them out, I only began to realize the scope of these themes myself upon many playthroughs, and I still discover new things even now. So, to answer my question from the beginning of this video, of why on earth I would replay a game like this, well, this is why. Before the Storm is a game that changes as the player changes, and it keeps them engaged by allowing the gameplay to exist in service of the story instead of the other way around. While the storytelling is vastly different from that of a book, it shares this quality that most good novels have, where the story shows you different things when you approach it from a different perspective. Anyway, thanks again, and feel free to subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this. I can't promise I will ever make something this long and thorough again, as it's been truly maddening, but I always aim to make high quality content that adds something to the conversation. Though, to be honest, I might just make a good old Elder Scrolls Online build video now, just to wind down. Hopefully I'll see you for the next one.